The diner buzzed with the usual clatter of plates and chatter of customers, but the atmosphere shifted when a group of leather-clad bikers stormed in. They laughed loudly, their presence commanding attention. At the counter, Emma, a young waitress with a warm smile and a determined spirit, tried her best to serve them politely. But the bikers weren't here for a meal. They were here to make trouble. They mocked her, their taunts growing louder as Emma struggled to hold her composure. The other customers glanced nervously, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. Despite the humiliation, Emma stood tall, her eyes betraying a flicker of strength that hinted at a deeper story. What the bikers didn't know was that Emma wasn't alone. Sitting quietly at a corner booth, her grandfather watched everything unfold. A man with a calm demeanor and piercing eyes, he was a hero of battles they couldn't begin to imagine, and he was about to remind them why. The old man sipped his coffee, his hand steady despite the years they had weathered. To the bikers, he was just another diner patron, insignificant and easy to overlook. But Emma knew better. She had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories, tales of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the face of danger. He was her quiet hero, the kind of man who believed actions spoke louder than words. Emma's heart raced as the bikers' taunts turned into jeers, their voices echoing through the small diner. She cast a quick glance at her grandfather, hoping for some reassurance. His expression hadn't changed. He simply stirred his coffee, his gaze fixed calmly on the group. One of the bikers leaned over the counter, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Cat got your tongue." Emma clenched her fists, her breath shaky but steady. Her grandfather quietly placed his cup down. The tension in the diner thickened as the bikers' laughter filled the air. Emma's hands trembled as she poured coffee for another customer, but she refused to let her fear show. Her grandfather's quiet presence in the corner was her only anchor, though he still hadn't moved or spoken. The leader of the group, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, tapped a fork loudly against his plate. "Hey, we're talking to you." He barked at Emma, his tone sharp enough to make the other diners flinch. Emma turned to face him, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I'll get your order in a minute." The biker smirked, leaning back in his chair as though he owned the place. "Oh, we're not here for the food," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "We're just making sure everyone knows who's in charge." In the corner, her grandfather adjusted his posture slightly, the smallest of movements, but it carried weight. A couple of the older patrons glanced at him, their eyes widening in quiet recognition. They knew who he was. Emma caught their reactions out of the corner of her eye. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips as hope flickered in her chest. These men had no idea who they were trying to intimidate. Her grandfather wasn't the kind of man to let bullies win, but he also wasn't the kind to act without reason. The bikers, oblivious, continued their charade. One of them grabbed a salt shaker, spinning it in his hand like a toy. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing in a dump like this?" he asked, his tone mocking. Emma ignored him, focusing on the coffee pot in her hands. Her grandfather, however, quietly stood and took a step forward. The room seemed to shift, the once chaotic noise dimming as people turned to watch. The bikers barely noticed, at least not yet. But something told Emma they were about to learn just how big a mistake they had made. The diner fell into a tense silence as Emma's grandfather walked slowly toward the counter. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, the sound of his boots against the floor cutting through the heavy air. The bikers finally noticed, their laughter faltering as they exchanged glances. "Can we help you, old man?" the leader asked, his voice laced with false bravado. He leaned forward, trying to regain control of the room, but his smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. Emma's grandfather said nothing at first. His gaze swept over the group, calm but piercing, as though he could see right through them. The quiet confidence in his demeanor made the bikers uneasy, though they tried to hide it. Her grandfather tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "I've seen men like you before. Loud, full of swagger, until they face someone who won't back down." A flicker of doubt crossed the biker's face, though he quickly masked it. "You've got guts, old man, I'll give you that," he said, his tone hardening. "But you're outnumbered." Her grandfather took another step closer, his presence alone shifting the dynamic of the room. "You're right," he said evenly. "I'm outnumbered. But that's never stopped me before." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado now tinged with uncertainty. Emma knew this was it, the moment everything would change. The leader of the bikers leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning as he tried to regain control of the moment. "Big talk for an old-timer," he said, crossing his arms. "Why don't you sit down before you hurt yourself?" Emma's grandfather didn't flinch. He looked straight into the man's eyes and, with a calm voice, asked, "Do you know what it takes to earn a silver star?" The room went still again, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Some of the older patrons exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of awe and understanding. A few began to sit up straighter, almost as if silently standing with him. The biker leader frowned, his confidence visibly cracking. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, the smugness in his tone fading. Her grandfather's eyes never wavered. "It's not for show," he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of memory. "It's for standing your ground when it matters most. For risking everything to protect the people who can't protect themselves." The bikers shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado giving way to something closer to fear. The leader glanced at his crew, searching for reassurance, but they were just as unsettled. Then, in a move no one expected, one of the older patrons stood up. He was a quiet man who had been sitting near the back, unnoticed until now. "He's telling the truth," the man said, his voice steady. "I served with him. Korea, 1952. Saved an entire unit under fire." The bikers turned to look at the man, their faces pale. The leader hesitated, unsure whether to dismiss the claim or take it seriously. But the growing murmur among the customers, many of whom clearly recognized Emma's grandfather now, made the decision for him. The tension in the room doubled. The bikers had come in expecting to dominate, but now they were facing a man who had already stared down greater threats than they could imagine. And with the weight of the room shifting, they realized they might not be in control anymore. The leader of the bikers clenched his jaw, his confidence unraveling as the weight of the room turned against him. His crew exchanged nervous glances, their bravado slipping with each passing second. But the man wasn't ready to back down completely. He stood up, towering over the others, and slammed his hand on the counter. "So what if you've got some fancy metal?" He spat. "That was a long time ago. You're just an old man now." Sharp as they scanned the scene. "We got a call about a disturbance," one of them said, his eyes landing on the bikers. The customers, who had been watching in tense silence, erupted into chatter. It didn't take long for one of them to point to the bikers, recounting their behavior and the threats they'd made. The leader's face turned a deep shade of red, and he tried to brush it off with a laugh. "We were just joking around," he said, holding up his hands. The officers weren't convinced. "Funny, that's not what we're hearing," one of them replied, stepping forward. As the bikers fumbled to explain themselves, Emma's grandfather leaned closer to the leader and spoke in a low voice only he could hear. "The difference between you and me, I earned my respect. You're just pretending to have it." The leader froze, the words hitting harder than he'd expected. He stared at Emma's grandfather for a moment, his bravado crumbling completely. Without another word, he signaled to his crew, and they began to shuffle toward the door, their heads low. But just as they were leaving, one of the bikers muttered something under his breath. Emma's grandfather turned, his calm gaze locking onto the man. "You might want to think carefully about who you mess with next time," he said, his tone steady but firm. The final twist came as the officers walked out after the bikers. One of them paused and turned to Emma's grandfather with a salute. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room erupted into applause, and Emma felt a wave of pride wash over her. Her grandfather returned to his seat, as calm as ever. "Now," he said, picking up his coffee, "how about we get back to breakfast?" The diner slowly returned to normal, though the buzz of conversation carried a new energy. The other customers couldn't stop thanking Emma's grandfather, some even sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served. Emma felt a swell of pride as she watched him handle the attention with his usual humility, brushing it off with a wave of his hand and a kind smile.